People say the league was a failure. It wasn't a failure. It fueled what came after it. It was there that all the people that started playing the game during the NASL 1968 to 1984 got their love of the game and played. And then when the MLS came out in 96, those were the group of people, I think, who'd seen the game who really felt, this is it, we're going to go for it.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey everybody, Tim Hanlon here. This is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for joining me. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. If you're a return visitor, we thank you for coming back as well. We appreciate all your social goodness and input and emails. Fantastic so far. Thank you so much for supporting the show so early in our journey together. Today, we're focused on professional soccer. People who know me know that that is a personal interest of mine from a long time ago, and arguably the impetus for getting this podcast underway. My old reminiscences of the old North American Soccer League, the Cosmos in particular in New York, and the star-studded players that grace the fields of Giant Stadium. My guest today is Bobby Moffat, the longtime stalwart defender for the Dallas Tornado franchise of the NASL, which frankly lasted a whole lot longer, perhaps uniquely so, than many of the franchises in the NASL that seem to come and go with great regularity. Bobby is one of those rare players that not only spent his entire American soccer career with one franchise, but also got to see the NASL from arguably some of its darkest days, when it was only 6 teams in the circuit in 1970, to, by the time he retired in 77, a league that had grown and mushroomed, perhaps a little egregiously so, to 24 franchises and seemingly an unending success story yet to come. We all know how that sort of came to an end a number of years later. But you're going to hear from Bobby some great stories and some pretty good insight as to why the old NASL was important, and frankly, a whole bunch of work that Bobby did and amongst his other teammates at the grassroots level back in the 70s in the Dallas Metroplex area, and then more broadly by playing in the United States at a time when soccer was not necessarily the gangbuster sport, both participatory and certainly spectator, as it is today. So we look forward to a couple of moments here with Bobby Moffat from the old Dallas Tornado coming up in a second. Before we get to it, I want to remind you that all of your Good Seats Still Available information needs can be met at our website, probably the best place, goodseatsstillavailable.com. All one word. Everything is there for you, all the feeds, all the places that our podcast is available, a place where you can send us some email, connect with us. Otherwise, if there's some stories or suggestions that you have, commentary, whatever it is, please send it along, and we're more than happy to hear what you've got on your mind, both good and bad. It's goodseatsstillavailable.com, and it'll tell you where you can find us on social media and all that kind of good stuff. So again, thank you for your early support, and we've got tons more in store for you in the months to come, and hopefully you'll stick with us as we explore all that stuff. Okay, let's not waste any more time. Let's get right to our conversation with the legendary Bobby Moffat, the old Dallas Tornado. So we welcome to our microphones the inimitable Bobby Moffat. And I guess, Bobby, maybe the best place to start is kind of at the start of your Dallas Tornado and United States soccer experience, circa, I guess, 1970-ish. How did you even get into the world of American soccer, which admittedly at that time was kind of on life support?
It certainly was. Ron Newman, who a well-known soccer coach, player in England, I watched him play at Portsmouth, my hometown club, Pompey as they're called. And then when I went to Gillingham after I left Portsmouth Football Club, Pompey, Ron was there. So he left after a year to come to the States and played in the 1967 league, the NPSL, and he then came recruiting to England in 1969 looking for people to go on a tour. The remainder of the tour the club was taking, the Dallas Tornado, of England, Scotland, and parts of Europe, and also looking for players for the 1970 season. So that's how that went about.
So Ron Newman was the guy instrumental in bringing you over to the States.
Correct.
Well, in addition to that, right, he's also probably one of the biggest pillars of the sport in keeping it going and frankly thriving in the years to follow, no?
In Dallas, he has a very strong legacy, and he did that in Atlanta and other places. And the curious part of that is, I mean, we're friends. We still talk fairly regularly in email and so on and so forth, as a lot of the old Tornado players do. But the fee for the game when they transferred me was that they play a friendly game at Chelmsford where I was playing. For my services, all the proceeds would go to the Chelmsford Football Club. So that was the deal Ron arranged. He was quite a canny individual, both on and off the field of play. Still is.
Yeah, well, obviously somebody we'd like to get on the podcast at some point. So after we're finished speaking, I'm obviously going to try to see if I can get some contact information. But all right, so give me a sense then of what you stepped into. I mean, it's probably a different world that maybe even you were expecting, despite the friendship with Ron and his, I'm sure, assurances that this was a worthwhile enterprise. But I mean, you're in the prime of your soccer playing career, and all of a sudden you're thrust into this league that only had, at the time, 6 teams?
Yes, it was a strange situation. We didn't know going in that it would only be that low, but there were also international games, so they also counted. 3 or 4 teams came over and played all the teams. So there was a round-robin effect, in effect. And there was 24 games that were played. We weren't very much up on the cost of living and other items such as that, but we quickly learned. And what we did, we played, and we had to get a second job. So that was a very interesting part. Getting used to the fields, sometimes with baseball diamonds on them, was very, very interesting. And traveling, of course, in Britain, I'd never flown until 1979 when we went from England to play in France on the tour. So flying to all the games was certainly a new thing. And all the attachments in the houses here, like the bit you put down your sink and you squirt it down and all those types of things, the ice maker, that wasn't too much an occurrence in Britain, but there certainly were here. So quite a few changes, but the big thing that made it interesting and nice was that the people were so friendly.
So it sounds like it became more of an adventure than sort of something to be burdened by.
Well, after the season, June and I, with Byron, our 1.5-year-old son, we drove straight down from Dallas to Mexico City, and I trained down there for 3 weeks. And then we drove back, which is something you certainly wouldn't want to do now.
Well, what were you doing?
It was an adventure, yes.
Sure. So part of that adventure then, I guess you said was working, I guess, a day job or side jobs. How did that sort of come about? Because the season obviously wasn't all that long, not many teams. What were you doing either in the off season and or maybe even during the season off the field?
The players that stayed through the year had regular jobs. Roy Turner worked at a car dealership. Louis Girassi worked at a transmission shop, but not too many players had full-time jobs. And my first job was Hunt Oil in the mailroom, which was a very, very privileged job, which I certainly got out of. And the club had found me that. They weren't the best at finding you jobs. I ended up trying to sell vacuum cleaners and encyclopedias, and in the end, worked at a place called Green Hill School where I cut the grass and trimmed the bushes and worked out in the heat for 40 hours a week, which was good training for the game when you play on the weekends.
Did you ever question the move, though, given that you were basically working a day job or a bunch of different odd/day jobs and playing versus arguably maybe being in a more full-time professional atmosphere and back in England?
It was a bit Harry Tate. That's an English expression for all over the place. Paul Waters, a lovely man, he was the chief executive of the club at the time, though I don't think he had that title. He put things together for Lamar Hunt. He said that I wouldn't have a problem getting a job, and that June, my wife, she had her own hairdressing business, wouldn't have a problem getting a job. But June did have a problem getting a job, and the job I had was in downtown Dallas, where they offered junior job as well, but they didn't coordinate. So when we got over here, we were told to get a place up in north of Dallas in Richardson, the next city. So the jobs we were given were an hour away each time. So there wasn't a lot of continuity there. So that was a point of dispute. And yes, it was mentioned a few times, but in the end, the club, Ron Yoon, got me the job cutting grass at Green Hill School, and we got by. The interesting thing is they wanted, halfway through the summer, another worker. So I got Oreco, who was a World Cup winner with Brazil in 1958. So
sure.
There was the disparity between our careers. We were both working at the same job in America.
Almost like going to
that's a Donald Trump fact.
It's almost like going to to get your driver's license. It's the great equalizer, right?
Yeah.
Well, it does sound that, though, you took to the Tornado, the North American Soccer League, and Dallas in particular. There's a quote here. There was an article written about Kyle Rote Jr. a couple of years ago. I don't know what the source. It's a local publication somewhere in Dallas, and he basically called you out and gave you a whole bunch of praise. I'll give you the quote. That's what the entrepreneurs did with the North American Soccer League. They did the mass marketing. In Dallas, the philosophy was anytime, anywhere. Bobby Moffat, Mike Renshaw, Kenny Cooper, Dick Hall, they were the real missionaries of soccer. They loved the game and were proud of it and wanted to introduce it to as many as they could. It seems like your entire career, both playing and then subsequent, is almost that of proselytizer of the sport.
Yeah, I think Kyle hit that on the head, and you must send me that quote. But we did. We went out there and we did some interesting things, and I mentioned the book that I'm writing about this is how the game grew, and it was through those types of moments you went out and you talked to kids and invited their family to come to games, and they started playing, and it grew from there.
It feels, though, and this is a bit before my time, I became a NASL fan roughly 75, 76-ish.
Well, I remember seeing you in the game down in San Antonio, April the 18th, 1975. You were wearing a hat.
I'm sure I was. But at 9 years old at that. But it did seem that, that the Dallas experience and your grassroots support of the sport, Ron's support, some of the other players I just mentioned, almost felt like, I guess, an anomaly, I think, maybe from some of the other teams in the league. Maybe almost you guys were the exception in terms of your trying to dig roots for the sport beyond just...
I think we were, and I think we got a lot of people. I know we got a lot of people that came down from other franchises to see how we were doing it. Not that we were greatly successful at the gate, though we were reasonable, and we grew as the years went by. But I think that the common touch was what was... the main thing that we could say we were doing there, and going out and kicking the ball around with people. But we tried everything we could do, and in the end, we made a living for ourselves, and most people, I mean, Cooper and Hall and Renshaw and myself and Neil Cohen, Freddie Garcia, all still live in the Metroplex, Billy Phillips. And it was an ethos that went on. I think the only other people that did that as well as we did were the indoor team, the Dallas Sidekicks. They followed the same pattern we did, and they were quite successful too.
So let's talk about actually going to the games. So you're playing in 1970, 1971. It doesn't seem like that Franklin Field was sort of the magisterial pitch that perhaps you got to play on in various locations in England.
It was the best field in the league, probably. The rest were very, very poor. In Washington State, you had a baseball diamond in the middle of the field.
So Franklin Field was actually quite good by comparison?
Yes, it was. And it wasn't great, but it was good. It was wide enough. What happens when you come over, you play on a narrow field that's mostly been used by baseball or by football, is the field is so narrow that it's not good enough for expansive soccer. It's 50 yards wide. So that was another problem.
That's interesting. You certainly can regale in certain. I mean, the playing field surfaces in the United States has always been an issue, and frankly, in some cases still is an issue today, especially at the minor league level. But it didn't seem to stop you all from having quite good seasons, including probably something that's most memorable to you, the championship season of 1971. Is there anything in particular that you remember from that that team and that sort of special moment?
But what was amazing was that we lost all of our top scorers. We just qualified for the playoffs in second place, which the following year in 72, only the top teams in each division qualified, so we wouldn't have. We lost our top scorers, our Greek scorer, Kurt Apostolidis and Tommy Jordan. They went back to, Tommy went to England and to play for Portsmouth, and Kurt went back to play for the Greek national team. We lost them, and other people had to step into. I had my jaw broken in Montreal halfway through the season, so I was out for a good third of the season. And we just pulled together. It was an amazing team effort. And what was amazing was the amount of games that we played. I think it was 6 games in 14 days. It was 15 days to win the trophy. It was ridiculous, but we did it.
But it was also ridiculous, too, because it seemed like that the playoffs that season were just dogged by interminably long games that were not decided by tiebreakers.
Yes, we played the longest game, as you put down in your material, 176 minutes ever. It's still a record. And people were walking around tired.
For our listeners, we're talking about September 1st, 1971, against the Rochester Lancers. It was, I don't know, something like 176 minutes or something until
176 minutes, and after we played full time, we just went into 15-minute increments. It was sudden death, and we happened to lose that game 2-1. And the fellow who was Mediterranean, who was the star for Rochester, and they had won the title the previous year. He said to the press afterwards, that should take care of Dallas now. Well, we beat them 3-1 down here. We hammered them here.
And what happened next?
And then we went there and won 2-1 in that 154-minute overtime to win the series.
But you're also burying the lead, because who had the game-winning goal to get you into the finals against Atlanta later on?
Yeah, I must confess to that. I did.
Well, and that's interesting, too, because it looks like you had quite a goal-producing season in 1970, but then in 71, your goal production kind of diminished a bit. Was that because of a position change? Were you more defensive positioned?
I played every position for the team except goalkeeper. I'm too intelligent to be a goalkeeper, I've been told. And in 1970, I only played 10 games on the front line. The other 14 were at the back. So scoring 8 goals, I thought was quite decent. Then when I came back the next year, Ron had some good strikers, Kurt Apostolidis, Tommy Jordan. We had another boy there from Liverpool who was a good player up front, and he played me at the back mostly.
So, what was the sense in Dallas? Did the fans notice? Was it hard to break through? Did people even pay attention, given how relatively small footprint the league was at that point?
Reading the publicity in the papers that I've got through the years, we got great publicity, whereas MLS, the Dallas team here, don't get anywhere near the publicity that we got. We were very well covered in the media, and gates did begin to increase. And if you'd like to get an idea of that, I can tell you exactly. When I came here, I heard that the attendance in 67 was 4,700. The leagues folded, they joined together. The attendance was 46.99. That's the average attendance. And by the time I finished playing in 77, it was 13.5. That's when Pele came here. But Dallas's attendance in 68 was 2,900, 69, 2,900, 70, 2,200. It only started going up again in 71 with 33. And when I started playing in 77, it was 16,005.
So that's probably not only a testament to the growing popularity of the sport and the publicity and Pele and all those other things, but frankly, probably your grassroots efforts really starting to bear some fruit.
I think it had a lot to do with it. And one of the things in 76, we got a madman for a GM who was mercurial. He was a workaholic called Dick Berg.
Sure.
And he went out there and beat the drums. And we had our own stadium built on SMU's campus in Dallas. And we started getting the good gates then. It only lasted for a couple of years, and then it started to go down. And the team then moved back to Texas Stadium. One thing I wanted to mention about the game, the 154-minute in Rochester, where we won and qualified, we ended up playing 9-a-side.
9-a-side?
Two players got into a fight before the end of regulation. 2 players got into a fight in the middle of it. So I started off on the front line. You're asking about positions. One got sent off 10 against 10. I went back to the midfield. One got sent off. I ended up at fullback. So when I scored the winning goal, and coming off a broken jaw, I'd trained so well, I was very fit. I was able to keep running the length of the field, and that's how the goal came. So happy memory. You brought back a nice one.
Well,
there.
But so not only are you dogged tired from playing extra period after extra period, but you're also on a big field now with, basically 4 less players.
Yes.
I'm surprised that you were able to stand and literally come back a couple of days later and move on to the playoffs.
It was amazing. Another thing connected to that is we talked about a game in Montreal. That's when I broke my jaw. Before the game, we had one of our bags of shoes not turn up from the airport. And then we played the game, which ended in a 0-0 draw. It was a miserable game, and we scored 2 goals that the referees were never going to let us win. And I got a broken jaw right away in the second half. And I all of a sudden ended up on the other side of the field. And when I got there, I was by their bench. This is the Olympics out of Montreal. And then I walked away, and one of the people on the bench was dressed in a white suit, as I remember it. White hat, white tie, white shirt. He came up behind me on the field and kicked me. He was one of the club's directors. And I turned around to say something to him, and spittles of blood came out of my mouth. You know how that happens? He then had a red and white uniform on him. Anyway, after the game, apparently, I was in the dressing rooms. Some of the players said, hey, they threatened to come get us afterwards. And we waited as long as we could in the dressing room. And then when we eventually went out there, to complete silence. At that moment, the van with our other shoes turned up. It was a magical moment.
And just the intensity, that's it's hard to believe, but it's not hard to believe because you're out there fighting and playing a game that you love, and it clearly paid off in 1971. How do you? So let's segue then, because you obviously came into an organization that had a lot of solid backing and stable ownership in the gentleman of Lamar Hunt in particular, and certainly his cohort, Bill McNutt. Any memories of them in the process? Yeah,
they were very good owners. You knew that you were going to get your paycheck, and lots of clubs I know suffered sometimes from that. Their intentions were good, and after the World Tour, they bankrolled in 67, 68 when the team went round on an incredible World Tour. They could easily have thrown it up their hands and said, we've had enough. But they stuck with it. They had a vision, and they made it succeed in the end.
Any personal anecdotes of Lamar Hunt's generosity or steely spirit? I mean, obviously he had a football team he was also tending to, and a newly integrated league into the NFL. Did you ever sense that the Dallas Tornado were, a secondary exercise for him, or was he full on and full in, as it seemed?
No, but he was. He had the common touch, and he remembered your family, your children's names. He was always personable. He could remember details. He was very punctilious. He would look at the field before the game and pick up stray items and things, and he would mention to you about different things that he felt could be done differently, or pass them on through Ron Newman. For example, paying attention during the national anthem, which to people from overseas is a strange thing to be standing and hearing the American national anthem being played, and he wanted us to be respectful, which we did, but apparently some of us were squirming and jumping up and down, preparing ourselves. So we learned from that. He had a unique perspective on things. His family, and Norma, his wife, was very beautiful, is very beautiful still, and both in both ways, particularly as a nice person, and she always remembered your name. So both of them were very, very good owners. And of course, Bill McNutt was not as personable, but he was as honest as the day is long. And you could rely on Bill that when he said something, by goodness, by Joe, he meant it.
And I suspect you were
solid owners.
Well, I suspect you were also well taken care of during the holidays when fruitcake time came about.
There's a few stories about that, but we have had some fruitcake. That is sure, yes. The fruitcake king.
For our listeners, yes, Bill McNutt had been was the fruitcake baron, I guess, and owned a substantial bakery and company focused on the delicious treat that is known as fruitcake.
Down in Waxahachie, Texas, which most people pronounce as Waxahachie.
Your accent belies your Texas spirit, Bobby. So
thank you.
So I'd love to hear some of your general impressions as the league and the Tornado kept marching through the 70s, because, and indeed you had a championship season in 71. You did very well in 72. I mean, you lost in the semifinals to the Cosmos. In 73, you were in the final game with the Philadelphia Atoms, the first year team that basically came into Texas Stadium at the time and won the championship in your backyard. Did you get a sense that the league and the team and the whole sport of soccer was building up some real impetus, some real action in the United States, or was it still kind of hard to sort of see?
You could see that there was certainly a stabilization going on. 69, the league was in disarray. Phil Woosnam and Clive Toye held it together, and they went for the cheap route. 1970, they started bringing back some teams, because in the 67 season they had, for the USA League, that was Lamar's league, they had Dundee United play for the Dallas Tornado, but they had 8 teams from overseas play in the USA League, or 10 teams, and they were West Ham and other teams from overseas. 68, they went into that one league, and that was 17 teams. That was not a very successful deal, and they thought the league had failed in 69. It just survived. 70, it was a little bit more stable. 71, it looked like it was going to go a bit bigger, and they brought in the 2 new teams, Rochester and Washington. And by 72, it started to wobble again, because we only played a 14-game season, having played 24-game seasons before. And it stabilized, and in 73, it looked good, and nobody dropped out of the league. Philadelphia came in, and then the next year, 74, we had a 15-team league. In 75, we had a 20-team league, some of which shouldn't have been brought in, some of the franchises, quite frankly. And then in the middle of 75, bang, 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 here comes Pele, and we get worldwide recognition, and we have players coming from all over the place. Standard went up, the gates started to go up, and it became very much something that people were aware of. The national commentary was not bad. You got some of it, but I always remember after the Cosmos game against Ron Newman's team, I believe, 77 or 78 or 79.
Fort Lauderdale Strikers.
Lloyd
right?
Turner and I were driving back from the office. He worked there and I worked in the office. I did the Soccer Surge, the paper and the game programs. And Harold Cosell was on there. I think they had 77,000 at the game. And it was against Fort Lauderdale.
Yep.
And Harold Cosell said, I've got to tell you, soccer has arrived. And it was one of those magic moments that you thought, yes, something magic has arrived. And it lasted for another 3 or 4 years. And then, unfortunately, due to bad management decisions, it dropped off and it stopped after the 74 season. But yes, there were definite signs that it was there. But people say the league was a failure. It wasn't a failure. It fueled what came after it. It was there that all the people that started playing the game during the NASL 1968 to 1984 got their love of the game and played. And then when the MLS came out in 96, those were the group of people, I think, who'd seen the game who really felt, this is it, we're going to go for it. And so the NASL, that's part of my book, didn't fail. It just didn't succeed as an entity. Does that make any sense?
Oh, it certainly does. You could also make the argument, and I'm curious to hear your opinions as a player at the time, of some of the innovations that came in the game at that time as well. And frankly, if I had a soapbox, I would say some of the world game could use some of these innovations yet again. But, 1973, there was the introduction of this 35-yard line, right, to sort of punch up, the offense a bit, or at least give, the offense a bit more chance to kind of linger closer to the goal and perhaps produce a few more goals. How was you as a classic traditional player? How did you and other players around you sort of react to that sort of? I suspect some felt it was a gimmick, but how did it play for you?
Well, the year before, 72, it was an 18-yard line.
Is that true?
In 73, they introduced the 35-yard line. And it was interesting. It didn't really change the game a great deal, quite frankly. And I don't think the goal scoring was very much different in either of those events. But it was something that FIFA granted permission to NASL to do. And then, of course, you had the shootout.
Well, that came a number of years later. I mean, just the fact that overtime actually was allowed to sort of creep in. But that shootout came in 1977. That's another innovation that frankly, anybody who's watched, Champions League penalty kicks.
No, the shootout came in 1974 to decide a tied game.
Yeah, I think those were penalty kicks, though.
PKs. PKs, yeah.
Correct.
It's the terminology that confuses, right?
Sure. But that 35-yard line version of the shootout, I think, was first in 1977, and arguably is a much more dramatic, maybe even hokey, but much more interesting and I think action.
Far more skillful, far more soccer related than a penalty kick.
And so
I loved it.
Okay, why did you love it?
Because of that. It was more skillful and it was more realistic. When I did my camps after I started the camps with the Tornado, after I retired from the Tornado, I ran my own camps, and that was part of the skills testing that we did. And when you saw Carlos in New York, what he did with the PK or with the shootout was just remarkable. Do you remember that?
I do. I was at that game. That's for those of
our
listeners.
Were you really? Oh, remarkable.
Well, yeah, that was so. Just to put that in context, and people who are listening, obviously, you should go to YouTube to watch that. But this was a dramatic playoff game in 1978, where the Cosmos had actually lost the first game to the Minnesota Kicks by a score of 9-2, and they were coming back to Giant Stadium 3 days later to play. At that time was you played a full game, and then the winner of if the other team won that game, you would go to a mini game, which was an actual shortened 30-minute game. But regardless, if the games were tied and sudden death didn't produce anything, you went to this 35-yard line driven shootout. And you have to look it up. And there was another dramatic one in 79. The Cosmos came on the short end of the stick during the playoffs. But there's this one moment where basically Carlos Alberto, instead of driving, on the ground with the ball and then taking a shot, he literally lifted it up with his leg in the air and let it bounce once or twice on the AstroTurf. And then gently on the second bounce, lifted that ball over the head of the Minnesota goalkeeper. I want to say it was Tina Lettieri. I'm not sure. And the place went bonkers. And I was convinced at that very moment, perhaps, more than ever, that is a far better way to try and win a game versus just a real crapshoot of a penalty kick.
I agree.
Well, there you go. I can tell you that's the only amount of lucidity you're going to hear from me this evening. But okay. Give me, so as the NASL rolled on in the 70s, I mean, you played with some tremendous players. I mean, any thoughts or remembrances of folks like Kenny Cooper, for example, or Steve Petcher, who was Rookie of the Year, or Kyle Rote Jr., for that matter, who was, literally the American boy star, I guess, in the early 70s before, the Peles and the superstars really came.
We were playing at New York, 1973, and we had to beat New York to get some more points, but we'd already qualified. So we went out there. Here is a scenario. If we had lost, Miami would have got in the playoffs. If New York win, they would get in the playoffs. So we play there, we go off, it's 1-0 us, they score 4 goals, we come back and get 2 penalties. If Carr scores the goal, he becomes the scoring champion. It was the last game of the season. Ilya Mitic picked up the ball, went to the center spot, and Ron Newman was screaming at him, Carl takes it, Carl takes it. We had to get the ball from Ilya and give it to Carl. Carl took the kick, scored the goal. From there, he's the scoring champion. And from that, he gets an agent, and he goes into the Superstars competition, and he wins it 3 times out of 4. Without that penalty kick, he wouldn't have had that. Kenny Cooper was the most consistent keeper in the league, and he had the game of his life many times against the New York Cosmos in 75, against Moscow Dynamo in 72. He was just a remarkable goalkeeper and still lives in the area. Jimmy Ryan played here. He played for Manchester United, has a 1968 European Cup winners medal. Alan Hinton came here, and he then went the next year to Vancouver, played for England in Derby County, top player. Jeff Bourne, who played for Derby County, lots and lots of players. Bobby Hope, Scots boy, he played here, very, very good. And then the players you play against, the George Bests and the Bobby Moores. I played against Bobby Moore and Jeff Hurst and Martin Peters in the UK. Played against Hurst and Bobby Moore here, and of course George Best, who was absolutely incredible. Pele and Pinalia, many, many good players, and a lot of them were not past their prime. Some were, but you also had the up-and-coming people like Peter Wise and the Hill boy that played for Manchester United, who went on to be stars back home, but they started off here. And Beardsley was the same way. Went to Liverpool and Newcastle. So there were some very, very good players here. And when it got to 76, 78, 9, and 80, standard was very high. It was very, very good. David Chabik, who played here, then went on to Fort Lauderdale, talked about it was a pleasure to go. He worked under Ron Newman as the assistant coach. He said, I had Muller and Kubius to work with on the field, and it was remarkable just listening. He was so enthusiastic. The fellow that's seen all these things was still enthusiastic about going in there and coaching all these players. Brian Kidd and so on and so forth.
I mean, it's really true. I think people who were fans back then of those games, I think were in some respects almost spoiled in terms of. I mean, you had some of the world's best players. I mean, bar none, playing in the North American Soccer League, and in some cases, frankly, somewhat anonymously, right? I mean, George Best was obviously, at the time, one of the world's best players, if not arguably the best at the time. And he could quietly live his life on Huntington Beach in California and not sort of be bothered by, the paparazzi that he probably would be back at Manchester United or wherever in Europe.
Yes. A number of players said that, and that's very, very true. That's what Mourinho said when he first went to London with Chelsea. I can walk the streets and nobody accosts me. Nobody tries to give me a hard time. They just let me be me.
All right, I got a couple of specific questions, and then I want to then segue into how your life and career has transformed since your playing days. But you mentioned playing against the Cosmos a number of times, and certainly Pele. I really have a personal curiosity about that Pele's first game, which was in July, I think, of 1975.
June the 15th.
June the 15th. So if I'm not mistaken, so correct me if I'm wrong, the game was held on a Sunday afternoon. It was on CBS television network at the crumbling Randall's Island Downing Stadium off the Triborough Bridge in New York City. Was that game an exhibition, not a regular season game? And how did that come about? Because you played in that game.
Yeah, we played in San Antonio the night before. And then we flew that next day to New York. And you kept thinking, if we were fogged in, what would they do for a team? And we played there. They painted the dirt green with a spray because it was CBS television. And they say 50 million people across the world actually watched that game.
So walk me through that, though. So you're playing in San Antonio. Did you win that game?
Unfortunately, they only won 2 games to start off, and they did us twice, 2-1. We lost 2-1 that evening. We played very tentative, and I think some of that had to do with going the next day to play against the Cosmos.
So did you, and then what did you do? Did you fly that over, you flew that night, I'm guessing?
No, the next morning. There was an evening kickoff. It was a 7:30 evening kickoff in San Antonio. We probably wouldn't have got a plane.
That's mind-boggling. I mean, the old NASL, obviously had a largely, especially in the middle and the latter part of the decade, had a compressed schedule. You're really talking about maybe a 4-month long-ish kind of schedule, but 3-day turnarounds and as you mentioned before, very long travel, distances that Europeans certainly not used to. But I can't imagine how you would have been expected to play a league game 2,000 miles away and then be fresh as a daisy, so to speak, for a nationally televised event the next day.
Perhaps the tireder we were, and the league wasn't as important to what was happening there, perhaps the tireder we were would have behoved the Cosmos, who could have got 4 or 5 goals on us. I don't know. But it happened at the last minute, as a lot of those things tended to. And it worked out to be very, very good for the game. In fact, the publicity was remarkable that came from that. And the reason I know it's June the 15th, I literally wrote a little bit about it today and edited it. So that's the reason I know. We did play the Cosmos back in Dallas, though, on July the 27th. And we had 26,000 people here in Texas Stadium.
And did you win that game?
We went to penalty kicks. It was one of those things where Pele left after about 70 minutes, and that was the game gone. And the game was tied at the end, so some silly so-and-so said, well, let's play extra time. And we did, and that was tied. So then they said, we'll go to a shootout. So it's almost 12 o'clock, and nobody wanted to be there after Pele left. So we should have just said it's a draw, which the first one, June the 15th in New York, was 2-2.
Okay, I got another question for you, and that's the indoor game. Did you play indoors during 71, 75, 76 when the Tornado were part of the various tournaments that the league was experimenting with?
71, I was out of the country, and the Tornado, went to St. Louis and won the first NASL tournament. There was just 4 teams involved. 75, they had a tournament, 4 different groups, Tampa, San Jose, Vancouver, I believe, and Dallas. And they each had 4 teams in it. So there was a round robin. You win it in your place, which we did. We then went, that was early January. That was January the 24th and 26th. You played 2 games, and the team with the best goals record won. And then you qualify for the playoffs. So there were 4 teams, 1 from each of the 4 groupings. And then you played the semifinals and the finals, and the place for 3rd place. And that was brutal. The refereeing was poor. The tackling was a bit off the wall. There were 3 broken ankles in that tournament, 14th through the 16th of March. It needed to be regulated, and it wasn't. But that was something the NASL wooed but never did properly. And in the end, that was one of the poison chalices that put them out of business, I think.
So how did the players adapt to this game? Because obviously it's a relatively foreign concept. I mean, you have boards and you've got checking and you got a lot of, it's much more physical. It's certainly a lot more, stopping and starting and running. It's a lot more creativity, I guess, with the ball in short spaces. Yet you're mentioning broken ankles and whatnot. I got to think it was somewhat of a challenge for players not used to those confined spaces and that kind of rough play indoors.
Usher has the saying, you learn by playing the game, and we learned by literally playing the game. Ron Newman was always thinking up ideas outdoor and indoor, so he gave us a bit of an edge there. On the physical side, I think teams were just unsure, and it's okay if you get bumped on an outdoor grass field. You can fall on grass, but indoors you can fall on turf, but you can also get rammed into the boards. And so it is a different mindset. You've got different shoes, different surfaces, shorter periods, and smaller goals, bigger goals, taller goals, wider goals, smaller. So who knows what's going to happen there. But it was bedlam to begin with, quite frankly, and gradually got sorted out. In 76, there was another tournament until they disbanded it for about 3 years. I don't think they played again until 79. And the 76 tournament was just, well, we're not going to spend much time on it because we wasted a lot of preseason in 75 working on indoor. And it left us a tangled outdoor schedule to work through. So, but there wasn't as much importance put on it in 76. And I think that was pretty accurate. Because here was the problem. What they were thinking, Woosnam had said that he wanted to have a season January through March out indoors and then go straight into the April through August season outdoors. The players, you wouldn't have any players left. They'll be injured.
Yet that's what the NASL faced in the early 80s as the MISL really started to gain some traction. There was that whole, hey, we're the originators of the indoor sport to begin with. Thus, we should play both indoors and outdoors, right?
They lost the plot there. They should have done it earlier if they were going to do it. And I think they should have done it after the outdoor season when it's in many parts, the climes in many parts of the country are different. I know it's hard to get indoor arenas, but they were available. I think they made a big mistake by not doing that. I really do.
Yeah, the sport of indoor soccer to me, in the MISL, which is a whole another ball of wax that we've got a bunch of other guests lined up for in the months to come, is, I think people kind of almost conveniently forget that, as the NASL petered out in 84 and 85, I mean, the top flight professional soccer in this country was the MISL indoor soccer. And frankly, some people even were resigned to the fact that might be what soccer would be going forward in the United States, and outdoor wouldn't.
But you talk about what built the game. We did camps. I was in charge of the first camps here in 70 in Dallas, and that went very, very well. I wasn't sure if I was ever coming back after the 70 season, and I came back by myself without my family for 3 summers. The end of 73, I got a job with McDonald's with a TV show, which lasted for nearly 2 years, Soccer Locker.
And I have looked on YouTube, and I have not been able to find it, Bobby. I think the world needs to see some old episodes of that show.
I've got 3 of the CDs left. The station doesn't have any. I don't have any. But we were just moving so quickly then, because after I lost the job, they gave the money. Can you believe this? They took my money away and gave it to Ronald McDonald and the Ronald McDonald fan. I can't believe that. But we had a good run. And all of a sudden, it's the 76, 77 season. You're asking about what I did after I finished. I finished playing in 77. 82, I brought in the Dallas Americans from the American Soccer League into Dallas so the American players could get playing time.
And that was basically a second division league that effectively was kind of the only thing around outdoors as the NASL collapsed, correct?
I went to Lamar Hunt before we actually bought the franchise, and I was not the money man. The other people I brought in were. And there were a lot of us working on that scheme. I said, Lamar, can we call it the Dallas Tornado? He said, I'd rather you didn't. So we didn't do that. But prior to that, I opened a shop, and then I started going into coaching, and that's when I opened my own camps, 79, 80, and up to 2011. And that's what we did, was camps, and then we had soccer tours. We took at least 6,000 Americans, that's players, coaches, and parents overseas to a lot of the European tournaments. And then we retired 5.5 years ago.
Well, it's clear that if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, even the 90s and 2000s in the Dallas Metroplex area, and had any inclination or interest or participation in the sport of soccer, I doubt seriously that you would not have heard of the name Bobby Moffat through all those grassroots efforts way back when as a player, and then obviously afterwards. It's pretty clear to me that that your passion for the sport, and your book, which you're working on, which we hope we can have you on again to talk about once it's hopefully published or in publicity. It's pretty clear that people like yourself were and are quite responsible for any of, I think, the current success of the sport in the United States today. And in many respects, almost, unheralded and needs to be further celebrated. So, beyond the Dallas area, perhaps a few folks will will recognize some of the contributions that folks like yourself have done for the good of the sport in this country, which, is still on the ascendance, right?
Well, thank you. And I think it is still on the ascendance. And you look back at the things you've left. We went over in 1980 on tour, and my father was in the British Royal Navy, and he invited a British Royal Navy youth team, to come to the Dallas Cup. So they've been coming for the last, since 1981. 4 years ago they stopped, and United Services team took them over every year. They come, they're hosted by the families, and I always believe that it's good for this British-American relationship to go well. I want it to stay together, never to fracture. So that was one thing. And the other thing that I've left that's permanent here is the Flame Fest, which is a tournament I put on with the Flame Soccer Club. And many, many people worked on that, and it's still going and raising lots of money for people. So it's always a pleasure when the Flame Fest and Dallas Cup come around, and the MLS season. I've already seen their games in the CONCACAF tournament. To see those things come around and think, well, yeah, that's good. Let's see what is going to happen now, and keep in touch. And it's when you run into your old friends. I was at the CONCACAF game against Pachuca last Wednesday, and there was Billy Phillips, and there was Neil Cohen, and the week before was Gordon Jago. Gordon Jago, you must get on about the indoor, by the way.
Love to. And I will follow up with you afterwards to get some phone numbers. So let me ask you one last sort of basic question. What are your impressions of professional soccer in the United States now? And could you ever have imagined it would be at the level it is now when you first came here in 1970?
No, and I couldn't imagine that it would be like it is in Britain now, the way it is and across the world. And I'm saddened that there's too much money in the game, and there's a big thing that saddens me is the cheaters that say they're Indian when they're really not. But the thing that worries me about the MLS is that they didn't want to make the same mistakes as the NASL, and I think they are. I think they're inviting too many people, and I don't think the standard has risen as it should have. I don't want to see it diluted as much as it has been in the past, and I know that the ownership owns all the teams. What I'm worried about is the flair. I think we've succeeded here, not just when we get gates and the owners are satisfied, but when the game begins to be played with flair. That's what I'm looking for in the American game. And there are some good players all of a sudden coming along, but they're playing in Europe. They're not playing up at Silic and Woods and a few others. They're not playing here. So I'm a bit concerned about that trend. Do
you think promotion and relegation would help the process here?
That's a very interesting debate to have, as I'm sure you're aware. And I don't think it's in the American DNA to have promotion. I mean, can you imagine the Atlanta? They come in the first year, they draw 55,000 the first week, they have a bad season. The next season, they're playing in a lower league. I don't think it fits the financial picture very well. Good one for discussion.
Yeah, one has to wonder. There's a part of me though that you have to give a fair amount of credit to what Don Garber and the owners have done with Major League Soccer. I mean, that to be able to grow the sport and have these.
Don Garber has done amazingly well. I congratulate him.
Oh, certainly. But there is an artificiality, right, to the support of the league when it's centrally owned, and you could argue the competitiveness and all that. So I think it'll be an interesting number of years to come to sort of see how 24 and beyond perhaps teams, which is NASL comparison territory, can succeed perhaps maybe with a few of those artificial support mechanisms removed from the process.
I suppose the answer to the league being the strong league is when MLS starts buying top name players at the top of their game.
Yep.
That would be the answer if the game has arrived. Not just one or two, but quite a few, one every club or so on and so forth. And I think that would fuel whatever happens.
Well, as we segue here to the closing here, I do want to sort of bring up one little piece of information that I thought was interesting. Bobby Moffat has not told us about a book that he actually wrote back in, I think it's 1974, called The Basic Soccer Guide. And I don't know if you've checked recently, Bobby, but the book is available on Amazon. There are copies out there.
Yes, I know it. Yeah.
And
that was amazing. Yeah, I wrote it, and it just flew. Everything. We've been so lucky. I mean, coming over here was lucky, and getting to run the camps was lucky, which was a precursor for my future career. And there were no books available I thought were written for the American people, so I wrote the book, and It sold 10,000. It actually sold 50,000, if you believe that.
Well, I will put a link to the book. I doubt any royalties will be coming your way, but
no, it's out of print now, I think. But what there is on Amazon now are old books. But there's another one called Intermediate Soccer too.
Well, very good. So there's some history there to be found for some of our completists out there who revel in North American Soccer League history.
There is one danger, though, with buying either of those books.
That is?
But if you pick it up too roughly, it might disintegrate.
Well, clearly your memories and your enthusiasm for the sport have not disintegrated one bit. And I can't thank you enough for being part of our fledgling podcast. I mean, this is maybe our fifth or so interview and episode. And I will tell you that soccer is probably the major reason for why I'm actually doing this. As I said in my emails and in our previous conversations, my days as a kid watching the Cosmos and watching you, I believe, at a game at Giant Stadium against the Cosmos, it was really the impetus for conversations like this. And I can't thank you enough for regaling us with some of your memories. And I look forward to keeping in touch and perhaps maybe another conversation down the line.
Tim, it's been a great pleasure. Call me anytime you wish.
You are kind, sir. Bobby Moffat, everybody. Thank you very much. Okay, there you have it. There's our chat with Bobby Moffat from the old Dallas Tornado. Some great stories there. I learned quite a bit there, and I consider myself somewhat of a completist when it comes to the old NASL, but the insight around the experimentation with the offsides line, I think everybody recognizes that in 1973, as we discussed, the 35-yard line experiment began, but what I didn't know was in 1972, in the middle of the season, which Bobby mentioned, they started to play around with that offsides line being at the 18-yard line. That is something that escaped me. I'm also really intrigued with more of that story about that first game Pele played for the New York Cosmos and the whole rigmarole that got the Dallas Tornado to hop on an airplane that day from San Antonio and get there in time for a national broadcast. I suspect that we're going to find out more little bits and pieces about that particular game with other guests as we move along. So I look forward to going further on those and many other things in the old NASL, as well as all kinds of other professional soccer stuff in the weeks and months to come. So thanks for listening. This is Tim Hanlon, and we appreciate your listenership. Find us on social media, download us multiple times, rate, review us. We love it. Thank you. We can't thank you enough. And we'll see you on the next episode coming up soon. Take care.